One of the most important kits in all of Space Marines has got to be the venerable drop pod. It's been chauffeuring Space Marines to the battlefield since 2008. Good year. Iron Man 1, Dark Knight, Housing Crisis, and somehow I have never actually owned one of these things. Although, I have used it in games.
And there you have, once you've torn those out, a drop pod. Now, keep in mind, this drop pod is very, very realistic. Most of the times, your opponents will probably not realize that this is not the GW kit. I think that it's very, very convincing and very fun to use.
I don't know whatever happened to those Cup of Joe drop pods, but they were really fun to use. I've never managed to fit a drop pod into my army because it's never been the sexiest purchase. There's always been stuff that's cooler. Land Raiders, Intercessors, Crusader Squads, Grimaldus. All of those things take precedence over the drop pod, but now that those things are all in my army, I think it is finally time to add one of these suckers, at least one, to my army. And I've always heard that this kit is an absolute nightmare to build and put together and requires magnets to get those flower petal doors to actually close up properly. I think it's finally time to crack this sucker open and experience a classic 40k kit. Although it's certainly an older kit now, it holds up pretty well. 2 identical sprues and a third to cap off the top and bottom. The mold lines aren't terrible, and the sprues are organized much better than some modern Space Marine kits. Although drop pods have been seen in most 40k videos and books, they don't seem to make their way to the tabletop very often, typically being too expensive or there's simpler ways of getting models onto the board. But now in 10th edition, it seems like they just might be a staple again. Already there are some annoying things, like the sprue connecting to the inner round parts of these thrusters, making it really hard to cut them off. Hopefully that's the annoying thing that the folks have been telling me about. Another thing I would like to share is the importance of super glue versus plastic glue. I, just like most people, switched to plastic glue early on in my hobby career and never looked back. But plastic glue is not perfect for everything. It takes quite a while to dry, and for large finicky things like these flower petal wings, it's the wrong tool. Super glue will hold fast and strong. There's plenty of connection points and it'll dry in seconds instead of minutes, greatly speeding up the build. Alright, I already see why this is going to be annoying. I typically don't like to do sub-assemblies, I feel like it slows me down. And that's usually fine with vehicles because usually there's boxes with fancy decoration on the outside, but this guy has a fully sculpted interior, and if I want to keep that interior really nice, I gotta leave this all unglued. So far, we're looking at about 7 parts, and hopefully that'll be it. Now I finally get to learn how the mechanics work, a bunch of hidden hinges in the butt of this drop pod. What struck me about the drop pod is that it's very much like putting together a squad of Space Marines. The vehicle is radially symmetrical, so each of these segments is identical. A really clever design, and it means that I do each step 5 times. And here is where the age of the kit rears its ugly head again. The center console doesn't really sit as nice as the original sculptor probably intended, so I had to smooth out the bottom and carve away a little bit of the center peg. A lot of folks don't even bother with the center console and seat belts for the interior of this sucker. These aren't load-bearing harnesses, and nothing would change if I didn't glue them in. But I like them, it adds to the story of the drop pod. The Space Marines walk in and the harnesses come down like a carnival ride. And speaking of the difference between the 2 glues, this is a perfect use of plastic glue. The harnesses are all wiggly and wobbly, so a little bit of plastic glue in the joints, and I can put on the glue while everything is all put together, and then use that long dry time of the glue to push and prod them into the perfect position while I wait for the glue to dry. Now it's time for these wings, and so far, it hasn't been the worst Space Marine kit to build, and I get to choose a weapon. The bolter is probably better in game, but I like the look of the missile launcher. I got all these wings stuck on, and this is where it all went wrong. These wings must be glued down first, and then you need to get this top bit into position. I found squeezing it inside and then gluing on the side panels was the best way I could think of to do this. Then turn the whole thing upside down and apply a frankly upsetting amount of pressure to get it to slide into place. Now it's basically right, but these wings need so much strength to squeeze them into place. So ultra thin super glue to the rescue. I poured some into the gaps and then squeezed all 5 wings as tight as I could. The super glue was essential. These connections are so tight if I used plastic glue they would have torn themselves out. I could have rubber banded this whole thing, but I worry the whole thing would have exploded like a watermelon. Now I finally get to assemble it, and lucky me, it's too tight to fit back together with the wings in place, so I sanded the bottom of each wing to get these 2 halves to fit together. And then of course, the doors were too tight, so I sanded the bottom of each door, and then that solved that problem. Another thing that makes the drop pod great is it comes with these faction symbols, including my boys, the Black Templar. Now it only comes with 4 and an Aquila, which technically the Black Templar don't use the symbol of the Aquila, but in my 10 years of hobbying I managed to pick up some more of these signs, so I can make a complete set. That is one drop pod built and assembled. Now, is its reputation as a difficult kit warranted? I would say absolutely. This thing is a nightmare. It really is a fussy, difficult kit to get it all built properly so that those doors can open. And nobody's gluing those doors shut. That would really be a waste. It is a frustrating kit, but now that I've got one and I'm holding it in my hands, it's pretty dang cool. It has some absolute girth to it. It's got some chonk in the bonk, as the cool kids say. Now, in terms of magnetizing those doors so they stay shut, I don't think I actually need to. If I just set this on a shelf or set this on a table and take my hands off, it actually stays together just with gravity. And then with just a little bit of touching, those doors will open right up. So I don't think I need to fuss with any magnets. I think I can get right on to painting. I pulled this octopus of a model apart and then it was time for paint. This is part of why I don't like sub-assemblies. I like to get it all done in one go, but it's not too big a deal to spray everything halfway and then come back and finish it off. And speaking of finishing it off, I have a saucy idea for how I'm gonna paint this sucker. A little dark red sprayed haphazardly over everything, then a little light beige, spraying spots of this randomly, and then some orange. This was fun and not being careful at all. I now have an orange chickenpox looking drop pod, and the reason that I want it to look so exaggerated is because I am doing some chipping medium. And in the past, I have used chipping medium to try to get a lovely rusty, flaky paint effect, and I always try way too hard on the original rust layer and I make it look beautiful and rusty and gross, and I spend all this time, and then only the slightest tiny little slivers of it are ever actually visible until all of that work just gets covered up. So big exaggerated orange-red blotchiness, chipping medium should give me the perfect results. I don't know what kind of witchcraft goes into this stuff, but it does what it says on the tin. It seals in the paint already applied and it makes the next layers fragile and easy to remove. Now I have to paint this sucker for real, spraying black paint over top of the rust I've already done, and it feels weird to cover it all up, but it'll be reappearing soon enough. Already the chipping medium is doing its job just for my handling. Now I zenithal the model, a white paint from above on the outside and inside. I've been slowly dipping my toes back into painting vehicles, and I always thought I didn't like to paint vehicles, but actually it just turns out I wasn't very good at it. Usually my step one was just spray it whatever color it's gonna be and then go from there. But that's why I didn't like painting vehicles, because it made them such humongous projects, they would take forever. Usually I can finish a dude or a squad in about one painting session, but vehicles would drag on. But a zenithal solves a lot of that problem for me, because the zenithal does such a beautiful job of highlighting every rivet and girder and steel piston and plate, and it just lets me start off with everything beautifully highlighted, and then I can go from there. I sprayed the model with a gray speed paint to match the rest of my Black Templar army, and I was thinking of doing some masking to paint these wing sections, but using a brush would probably be much simpler. I used Vallejo Stonewall Gray, the latest paint I have that has great coverage, and in two thin coats, these parts were nice and gray. I used the airbrush to brighten them up a little bit more with some white ink. A dry brushing helped to highlight all the little edges and rivets on the model, and to start to add a little grit and grime, some brown ink on the wings to make them look like they're covered in the same dust the rest of my army is based with. On the inside, I hosed down the harnesses with some Nuln Oil, and this drop pod was looking factory fresh. Right now, my drop pod is pretty much fresh off the assembly line. The Tech Marines have just given it a new coat of paint, and it's looking pristine, with that chipping medium still under there, and it's time to ruin it. I put some plain old water into my airbrush to moisturize the paint. I went a little too heavy on the water. It doesn't have to be dripping wet. Then I took a janky old stiff bristle brush and started going to town, rubbing this all over, revealing the orangey paint underneath. I wish I had a stiffer brush, but this one got the job done. A toothpick helped to scrape the paint off of the corners and edges of the armor panels. It's sort of like edge highlighting, but instead of careful brush strokes and perfectly thin paint, it's gouging at the model with a stick. The airbrush layers peeled off perfectly. The brush-on paint was a little more tenacious because it's much thicker, but some aggressive prodding with the toothpick did the trick. Oh yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. Now I can hear some of you saying, Jay, that's a little much with the weathering. And you know what? I don't think so. I think this is the perfect amount of weathering. I think pre-weathering, that's probably what it looked like when it was docked with the spaceship in orbit. But by the time it gets to the planet's surface, I think it looks like this, if not worse. Just screaming through all of the atmospheres, and these are 40K atmospheres. They're probably even worse, taking enemy fire, moving so fast that the friction of the air around it is probably getting the surface of the drop pod red hot, and then moments before impact, it fires its jets just to slow itself down just enough so that it doesn't punch a hole in the earth and leave the Space Marines trapped. This thing would be absolutely trashed after every single battle. And there's more weathering to do, but right now I gotta lock in the flavor. I'm gonna put a varnish on this guy right before I do the metallics. I'm doing a varnish now for two reasons. One, to stop any further paint chipping from happening, and because I don't like to varnish over true metallics. It always changes the look and sparkle, so varnishing now will let my metallics shine. And you know what else shines? That's right, our Patreon. Over there, we have a new STL train set every single month. This month, we have the Corpse Cannery, a factory where food is made by humans from humans. I put some metallics on my dry palette and began dry brushing. I didn't dry brush everywhere, just the spots I thought would get the most wear and tear, the corners of doors and hinges. And this bright silver really popped against the dark gray walls. Now I finally get to assemble the sucker, and now that it's all together, I put on the finishing touches, like the little eagles and skulls that 40K likes to hide everywhere, like the hidden Mickeys at Disney World. Ah, the mighty drop pod. I probably should have always had a bunch of drop pods in my army as I play Black Templar, the close combat focused Space Marines. It probably would have helped a lot, because I don't know if I ever won a single game of 6th, 7th, or 8th edition with my Templar. But now, in 10th edition, I'm very excited. When I take this sucker in 10th edition, I'm gonna fill it full of 10 Infernus Marines, 2 squads of 5, so they're reasonably safe from the blast rule, and maybe even the Emperor's Champion too. This model has deep strike, so it can arrive in style anywhere on the board 9 inches away from enemy models. I don't expect my models to last long out there in enemy territory, but man, are they gonna lay down some heat, right where my enemy doesn't want it. And that is all thanks to the drop pod. The drop pod has been on my periphery, it's been in my to-buy list for a long time now, and I'm very glad I finally have one. It's a very fun unit, it seems like it might be a very good unit, and it's a very flavorful unit. The Space Marines are the Emperor's avenging angels. They drop from the heavens to get onto the ground and then to rip and tear. I gotta be honest, I don't win a lot of games, but I'm trying. I'm trying, Ringo. I'm trying real hard to get good. And I think adding a drop pod to my list is gonna be just the thing to help me achieve my goals. Thanks for watching.